War and Peace, Book 10, Chapter 16, read for LibriVox.org by David Ream. "Well, that's all," said Kutúzov as he signed the last of the documents, and rising heavily and smoothing out the folds in his fat white neck, he moved towards the door with a more cheerful expression. The priest's wife, flushing rosy red, caught up the dish she had not managed to present at the right moment after all, though she had so long been preparing for it, and with a low bow offered it to Kutúzov. He screwed up his eyes, smiled, lifted her chin with his hand, and said, "Ah, what a beauty! Thank you, sweetheart." He took some gold pieces from his trouser pocket and put them on the dish for her. "Well, my dear, and how are we getting on?" he asked, moving to the door of the room assigned to him. The priest's wife smiled, and with dimples in her rosy cheeks followed him into the room. The adjutant came out to the porch and asked Prince Andrew to lunch with him. Half an hour later, Prince Andrew was again called to Kutúzov. He found him reclining in an armchair, still in the same unbuttoned overcoat. He had in his hand a French book, which he closed as Prince Andrew entered, marking the place with a knife. Prince Andrew saw by the cover that it was Les Chevaliers du Seigneur by Madame du Genlis. "Well, sit down, sit here. Let's have a talk," said Kutúzov. "It's sad, very sad. But remember, my dear fellow, that I'm a father to you, a second father." Prince Andrew told Kutúzov all he knew of his father's death, and what he had seen at Bald Hills when he passed through it. What they have brought us to!" Kutúzov suddenly cried in an agitated voice, evidently picturing vividly to himself from Prince Andrew's story the condition Russia was in. "But give me time, he said with a grim look, evidently not wishing to continue this agitating conversation, and added, "I sent for you to keep you with me." "I thank your Serene Highness, but fear I am no longer fit for the staff," replied Prince Andrew with a smile which Kutúzov noticed. Kutúzov glanced inquiringly at him. "But above all," added Prince Andrew, "I've grown used to my regiment, am fond of the officers, and I fancy the men also like me. I should be sorry to leave the regiment. If I decline the honor of being with you, believe me..." A shrewd, kindly, yet subtly derisive expression lit up Kutúzov's podgy face. He cut Bolkónski short. "I am sorry, for I need you, but you're right. It's not here that men are needed. Advisors are always plentiful, but men are not. The regiments would not be what they are if the would-be advisors served there as you do. I remember you at Austerlitz. I remember you with the standard," said Kutúzov, and a flush of pleasure suffused Prince Andrew's face at this recollection. Taking his hand and drawing him downwards, Kutúzov offered his cheek to be kissed, and again Prince Andrew noticed tears in the old man's eyes. Though Prince Andrew knew that Kutúzov's tears came easily, and that he was particularly tender to and considerate of him from a wish to show sympathy with his loss, yet this reminder of Austerlitz was both pleasant and flattering to him. "Go your way, and God be with you. I know your path is the path of honor." He paused. "I missed you at Bucharest, but I needed someone to send." And changing the subject, Kutúzov began to speak of the Turkish war and the peace that had been concluded. "Yes, I have been much blamed," he said, "both for that war and the peace, but everything came at the right time. Tout vient à point celui qui sait attendre. And there were as many advisors there as here," he went on, returning to the subject of advisors, which evidently occupied him. "Ah, those advisors," said he. "If we had listened to them all, we should not have made peace with Turkey, and should not have been through with that war. Everything in haste, but more haste, less speed. Kamensky would have been lost if he had not died. He stormed fortresses with 30,000 men. It is not difficult to capture a fortress, but it is difficult to win a campaign. For that, not storming and attacking, but patience and time are wanted. Kamensky sent soldiers to Rustchuk, but I only employed these two things and took more fortresses than Kamensky and made the Turks eat horseflesh." He swayed his head. "And the French shall too, believe me," he went on, growing warmer and beating his chest. "I'll make them eat horseflesh." And tears again dimmed his eyes. "But shan't we have to accept battle?" remarked Prince Andrew. "We shall if everybody wants it. It can't be helped. But believe me, my dear boy, there is nothing stronger than those two. Patience and time, they will do it all. But the advisors, non tant pan de setare, voilà le mal. Some want a thing, others don't. What's one to do? He asked, evidently expecting an answer. Well, what do you want us to do? He repeated, and his eyes shone with a deep, shrewd look. I'll tell you what to do, he continued, as Prince Andrew still did not reply. I will tell you what to do, and what I do. Dans les doutes, mon cher. He paused. Abstiens-toi. He articulated the French proverb deliberately. Well, goodbye, my dear fellow. Remember that with all my heart I share your sorrow, and that for you I am not a serene highness, nor a prince, not a commander-in-chief, but a father. If you want anything, come straight to me. Goodbye, my dear boy. Again he embraced and kissed Prince Andrew, but before the latter had left the room, Kutúzov gave a sigh of relief and went on with his unfinished novel, Les Chevaliers de Sion by Madame Jolie. Prince Andrew could not have explained how or why it was, but after that interview with Kutúzov he went back to his regiment reassured as to the general course of affairs and as to the man to whom it had been entrusted. The more he realized the absence of all personal motive in that old man, in whom there seemed to remain only the habit of passions, and in place of an intellect, grouping events and drawing conclusions, only the capacity calmly to contemplate the course of events, the more reassured he was that everything would be as it should. He will not bring in any plan of his own, he will not devise or undertake anything, thought Prince Andrew, but he will hear everything, remember everything, and put everything in its place. He will not hinder anything useful, nor allow anything harmful. He understands that there is something stronger and more important than his own will, the inevitable course of events, and he can see them and grasp their significance, and seeing that significance can refrain from meddling and renounce his personal wish directed to something else. And, above all, thought Prince Andrew, one believes in him because he's Russian, despite the novel by Jean Lee and the French proverbs, and because his voice shook when he said, "What they have brought us to," and had a sob in it when he said he would make them eat horseflesh. On such feelings, more or less dimly shared by all, the unanimity and general approval were founded with which, despite court influences, the popular choice of Kutúzov as commander-in-chief was received. End of chapter 16, recording by David Ream, Sacramento, California, fourteatoo.blogspot.com. Book 10, Chapter 17, of War and Peace. Read for LibriVox.org by David Ream. After the Emperor had left Moscow, life flowed on there in its usual course, and its course was so very usual that it was difficult to remember the recent days of patriotic elation and ardor, hard to believe that Russia was really in danger, and that the members of the English Club were also sons of the fatherland, ready to sacrifice everything for it. The one thing that recalled the patriotic fervor everyone had displayed during the Emperor's stay was the call for contributions of men and money, a necessity that, as soon as the promises had been made, assumed a legal, official form and became unavoidable. With the enemy's approach to Moscow, the Muscovites' view of the situation did not grow more serious, but on the contrary became even more frivolous, as always happens with people who see a great danger approaching. At the approach of danger, there are always two voices that speak with equal power in the human soul. One very reasonably tells a man to consider the nature of the danger and the means of escaping it. The other, still more reasonably, says that it is too depressing and painful to think of the danger, since it is not in a man's power to foresee everything and avert the general course of events, and it is therefore better to disregard what is painful till it comes, and to think about what is pleasant. In solitude, a man generally listens to the first voice, but in society to the second. So it was now with the inhabitants of Moscow. It was long since people had been as gay in Moscow as that year. Rostopchin's broadsheets, headed by woodcuts of a drink shop, a potman, and a Moscow burgher called Karpushka Chigirin, quote, who, having been a militiaman and having had rather too much at the pub, heard that Napoleon wished to come to Moscow, grew angry, abused the French in very bad language, came out of the drink shop, and under the sign of the eagle began to address the assembled people, were read and discussed together with the latest of Vasily Lvovich Pushkin's Butrem. In the corner room at the club, members gathered to read these broadsheets, and some liked the way Karpushka jeered at the French, saying, "They will swell up with Russian cabbage, burst with our buckwheat porridge, and choke themselves with cabbage soup. They are all dwarfs, and one peasant woman will toss 3 of them with a hay-fork." Others did not like that tone, and said it was stupid and vulgar. It was said that Rostopchín had expelled all Frenchmen and even all foreigners from Moscow, and that there had been some spies and agents of Napoleon among them, but this was told chiefly to introduce Rostopchín's witty remark on that occasion. The foreigners were deported to Nizhny by boat, and Rostopchín had said to them in French, "Rentrez en vous-même, entrez dans la barque et ne faites pas un bac de charbon." Translation note: think it over, get into the bark, and take care not to make it a bark of Karen. There was talk of all the government offices having been already removed from Moscow, and to this Shinshin's witticism was added, that for that alone Moscow ought to be grateful to Napoleon. It was said that Mamonov's regiment would cost him 800,000 rubles, and that Bezhukov had spent even more on his, but the best thing about Bezhukov's action was that he himself was going to don a uniform and ride at the head of his regiment without charging anything for the show. "You don't spare anyone," said Julie Drubetskaya as she collected and pressed together a bunch of raveled lint with her thin, beringed fingers. Julie was preparing to leave Moscow next day and was giving a farewell soiree. "Bezhukov is ridicule, but he is so kind and good-natured. What pleasure is there to be so caustique?" "A forfeit!" cried a young man in a militia uniform, whom Julie called Mon Chevalier, and who was going with her to Nizhny. In Julie's set, as in many other circles in Moscow, it had been agreed that they would speak nothing but Russian, and that those who made a slip and spoke French should pay fines to the Committee of Voluntary Contributions. "Another forfeit for a Gallicism," said a Russian writer who was present. "What pleasure is there to be is not Russian." "You spare no one," continued Julie to the young man, without heeding the author's remark. "For caustique I am guilty and will pay, and I am prepared to pay again for the pleasure of telling you the truth. For Gallicisms I won't be responsible," she remarked, turning to the author. "I have neither the money nor the time, like Prince Galitzin, to engage a master to teach me Russian." "Ah, here he is," she added. "Content." "No, no," she said to the militia officer, "you won't catch me. Speak of the sun and you see its rays," and she smiled amiably at Pierre. "We were just talking of you," she said with the facility in lying natural to a society woman. "We were saying that your regiment would be sure to be better than Momonov's." "Oh, don't talk to me of my regiment," replied Pierre, kissing his hostess's hand and taking a seat beside her. "I am so sick of it." "You will, of course, command it yourself," said Julie, directing a sly, sarcastic glance towards the militia officer. The latter, in Pierre's presence, had ceased to be caustic, and his face expressed perplexity as to what Julie's smile might mean. In spite of his absent-mindedness and good nature, Pierre's personality immediately checked any attempt to ridicule him to his face. "No," said Pierre, with a laughing glance at his big, stout body. "I should make too good a target for the French. Besides, I am afraid I should hardly be able to climb onto a horse." Among those whom Julie's guests happened to choose to gossip about were the Rostovs. "I hear that their affairs are in a very bad way," said Julie. "And he is so unreasonable, the count himself, I mean. The Razumovskys wanted to buy his house and his estate near Moscow, but it drags on and on. He asks too much." "No, I think the sale will come off in a few days," said someone. "Though it is madness to buy anything in Moscow now." "Why?" asked Julie. "You don't think Moscow's in danger?" "Then why are you leaving?" "I? What a question! I am going because, well, because everyone is going, and besides, I'm not Joan of Arc or an Amazon." "Well, of course, of course. Let me have some more strips of linen." "If he manages the business properly, he'll be able to pay off all his debts," said the militia officer, speaking of Rostov. "A kindly old man, but not up to much. And why do they stay on so long in Moscow? They meant to leave for the country. "A long time ago. Natalia is quite well again now, isn't she?" Julie asked Pierre with a knowing smile. "They are waiting for their younger son," Pierre replied. "He joined Oblensky's Cossacks and went to Belia Trukov, where the regiment is being formed. But now they have had him transferred to my regiment and are expecting him every day. The count wanted to leave long ago, but the countess won't on any account leave Moscow till her son returns. I met them the day before yesterday at the Arkharovs. Natalia has recovered her looks and is brighter. She sang a song. How easily some people get over everything." "Get over what?" inquired Pierre, looking displeased. Julie smiled. "You know, Count, such knights as you are only found in Madame de Souza's novels." "What knights? What do you mean?" demanded Pierre, blushing. "Oh, come, my dear Count. C'est la fable de tout Moscou. Je vous admire, ma parole d'honneur." "It is the talk of all Moscow. My word, I admire you." "Forfeit, forfeit!" cried the militia officer. "All right, one can't talk. How tiresome!" "What is the talk of all Moscow?" Pierre asked angrily, rising to his feet. "Come now, Count, you know." "I don't know anything about it," said Pierre. "I know you were friendly with Natalia, and so... But I was always more friendly with Vera, that dear Vera." "No, madam," Pierre continued in a tone of displeasure. "I have not taken on myself the role of Natalia Rostova's knight at all, and have not been their house for nearly a month. But I cannot understand the cruelty." "Qui s'excuse accuse." "Who excuses himself accuses himself," said Julie, smiling and waving the lint triumphantly, and to have the last word she promptly changed the subject. "Do you know what I heard today? Poor Mary Bolkónskaya arrived in Moscow yesterday. Do you know that she has lost her father?" "Really? Where is she? I should very much like to see her," said Pierre. "I spent the evening with her yesterday. She is going to their estate near Moscow either today or tomorrow morning with her nephew." "Well, and how is she?" asked Pierre. "She is well but sad. But do you know who rescued her? It is quite a romance. Nicholas Rostov. She was surrounded and they wanted to kill her and had wounded some of her people. He rushed in and saved her." "Another romance," said the militia officer. "Really, this general flight has been arranged to get all the old maids married off. Katish is one and Princess Bolkónskaya another. Do you know, I really believe she is un petit peu amoureuse du jeune homme, a little bit in love with the young man." "Forfeit, forfeit, forfeit! But how could one say that in Russian?" End of Book 10, Chapter 17, read by David Ream, Sacramento, California, January 19th, 2009. Book 10, Chapter 18, read for LibriVox.org by David Ream. When Pierre returned home, he was handed two of Rostopchín's broadsheets that had been brought that day. The first declared the report that Count Rostopchín had forbidden people to leave Moscow was false. On the contrary, he was glad that ladies and tradesmen's wives were leaving the city. "There will be less panic and less gossip," ran the broadsheet, "but I will stake my life on it that they will not enter Moscow." These words showed Pierre clearly for the first time that the French would enter Moscow. The second broadsheet stated that our headquarters were at Vyazma, that Count Wittgenstein had defeated the French, but that as many of the inhabitants of Moscow wished to be armed, weapons were ready for them at the arsenal, sabers, pistols, and muskets, which could be had at a low price. The tone of the proclamation was not as jocose as in the former Chigirin talks. Pierre pondered over these broadsheets. Evidently the terrible storm cloud he had desired with the whole strength of his soul, but which yet aroused involuntary horror in him, was drawing near. "Shall I join the army and enter the service, or wait?" he asked himself for the 100th time. He took a pack of cards that lay on the table and began to lay them out for a game of patience. "If this patience comes out," he said to himself after shuffling the cards, holding them in his hand and lifting his head, "if it comes out, it means... what does it mean?" He had not decided what it should mean when he heard the voice of the eldest princess at the door asking whether she might come in. "Then it will mean that I must go to the army," said Pierre to himself. Come in," he added to the princess. Only the eldest princess, the one with the stony face and long waist, was still living in Pierre's house. The two younger ones had both married. "Excuse my coming to you, cousin," she said in a reproachful and agitated voice. "You know some decision must be come to. What is going to happen? Everyone has left Moscow and the people are rioting. How is it that we are staying on?" "On the contrary, things seem satisfactory, ma cousine," said Pierre, in the bantering tone he habitually adopted toward her, always feeling uncomfortable in the role of her benefactor. "Satisfactory indeed, very satisfactory. Barbara Ivanovna told me today how our troops are distinguishing themselves. It certainly does them credit, and the people too are quite mutinous. They no longer obey, even my maid has taken to being rude. At this rate they will soon begin beating us. One can't walk in the streets. But above all, the French will be here any day now. So what are we waiting for? I ask just one thing of you, cousin," she went on. "Arrange for me to be taken to Petersburg. Whatever I may be, I can't live under Bonaparte's rule." "Oh, come, ma cousine. Where do you get your information from?" "On the contrary, I won't submit to your Napoleon. Others may if they please. If you don't want to do this, but I will, I'll give the order at once." The princess was apparently vexed at not having anyone to be angry with. Muttering to herself, she sat down on a chair. "But you have been misinformed," said Pierre. "Everything is quiet in the city and there is not the slightest danger. See, I've just been reading." He showed her the broadsheet. "Count Rostopchín writes that he will stake his life on it that the enemy will never enter Moscow." "Oh, that count of yours," said the princess malevolently. "He's a hypocrite, a rascal who has himself roused the people to riot. Didn't he write in those idiotic broadsheets that anyone, whoever it might be, should be dragged to the lockup by his hair? How silly! And honor and glory to whoever captures him, he says. This is what his cajolery has brought us to. Barbara Ivanovna told me the mob near killed her because she said something in French." "Oh, but it's so. You take everything so to heart," said Pierre, and began laying out his cards for patience. Although that patience did come out, Pierre did not join the army, but remained in deserted Moscow, ever in the same state of agitation, irresolution, and alarm, yet at the same time joyfully expecting something terrible. Next day, toward evening, the princess set off, and Pierre's head steward came to inform him that the money needed for the equipment of his regiment could not be found without selling one of the estates. In general, the head steward made out to Pierre that his project of raising a regiment would ruin him. Pierre listened to him, scarcely able to repress a smile. "Well then, sell it," said he. "What's to be done? I can't draw back now." The worse everything became, especially his own affairs, the better was Pierre pleased, and the more evident was it that the catastrophe he expected was approaching. Hardly anyone he knew was left in town. Julie had gone, and so had Princess Mary. Of his intimate friends, only the Rostóvs remained, but he did not go to see them. To distract his thoughts, he drove that day to the village of Vorontsóvo to see the great balloon Lepich was constructing to destroy the foe, and a trial balloon that was to go up next day. The balloon was not yet ready, but Pierre learned that it was being constructed by the Emperor's desire. The Emperor had written to Count Rostopchín as follows: "As soon as Lepich is ready, get together a crew of reliable and intelligent men for his car and send a courier to General Kutúzov to let him know. I have informed him of the matter. Please impress upon Lepich to be very careful where he descends for the first time, that he may not make a mistake and fall into the enemy's hands. It is essential for him to combine his movements with those of the commander-in-chief." On his way home from Vorontsóvo, as he was passing the Bolotnoye place, Pierre, seeing a large crowd round the Lobnoye place, stopped and got out of his trap. A French cook accused of being a spy was being flogged. The flogging was only just over, and the executioner was releasing from the flogging bench a stout man with red whiskers, in blue stockings and a green jacket, who was moaning piteously. Another criminal, thin and pale, stood near. Judging by their faces, they were both Frenchmen. With a frightened and suffering look resembling that on the thin Frenchman's face, Pierre pushed his way in through the crowd. "What is it? Who is it? What is it for?" he kept asking. But the attention of the crowd, officials, burghers, shopkeepers, peasants, and women in cloaks and in pelisses, was so eagerly centered on what was passing in Lobnoye Place that no one answered him. The stout man rose, frowned, shrugged his shoulders, and evidently, trying to appear firm, began to pull on his jacket without looking about him. But suddenly his lips trembled and he began to cry, in the way full-blooded grown men cry, though angry with himself for doing so. In the crowd, people began talking loudly to stifle their feelings of pity, as it seemed to Pierre. "He's cook to some prince." "Eh, monsieur! Russian sauce seems to be sour to a Frenchman. Sets his teeth on edge," said a wrinkled clerk who was standing behind Pierre when the Frenchman began to cry. The clerk glanced round, evidently hoping that his joke would be appreciated. Some people began to laugh, others continued to watch in dismay the executioner who was undressing the other man. Pierre choked, his face puckered, and he turned hastily away, went back to his trap muttering something to himself as he went, and took his seat. As they drove along, he shuddered and exclaimed several times so audibly that the coachman asked him, "What is your pleasure?" "Where are you going?" shouted Pierre to the man who was driving to Lubyanka Street. "To the governor's, as you ordered," answered the coachman. "Fool! Idiot!" shouted Pierre, abusing his coachman, a thing he rarely did. "Home, I told you, and drive faster, blockhead. I must get away this very day," he murmured to himself. At the sight of the tortured Frenchman and the crowd surrounding the Lubnoye Place, Pierre had so definitely made up his mind that he could no longer remain in Moscow and would leave for the army that very day that it seemed to him that either he had told the coachman this or that the man ought to have known it for himself. On reaching home, Pierre gave orders to Evstáfey, his head coachman, who knew everything, could do anything, and was known to all Moscow, that he would leave that night for the army at Moskaysk and that his saddle horses should be sent there. This could not all be arranged that day, so, on Evstáfey's reputation, Pierre had to put off his departure till next day to allow time for the relay horses to be sent on in advance. On the 24th, the weather cleared up after a spell of rain, and after dinner Pierre left Moscow. When changing horses that night in Perkushkovo, he learned that there had been a great battle that evening. This was the Battle of Shevardino. He was told that there in Perkushkovo the earth trembled from the firing, but nobody could answer his questions as to who had won. At dawn next day, Pierre was approaching Mozháysk. Every house in Mozháysk had soldiers quartered in it, and at the hostel where Pierre was met by his groom and coachman there was no room to be had. It was full of officers. Everywhere in Mozháysk and beyond it, troops were stationed or on the march. Cossacks, foot and horse soldiers, wagons, caissons, and cannon were everywhere. Pierre pushed forward as fast as he could, and the farther he left Moscow behind, and the deeper he plunged into the sea of troops, the more was he overcome by restless agitation and a new and joyful feeling he had not experienced before. It was a feeling akin to what he had felt at the Sloboda Palace during the Emperor's visit, a sense of the necessity of undertaking something and sacrificing something. He now experienced a glad consciousness that everything that constitutes men's happiness, the comforts of life, wealth, even life itself, is rubbish it is pleasant to throw away, compared with something. With what? Pierre could not say, and he did not try to determine for whom and for what he felt such particular delight in sacrificing everything. He was not occupied with the question of what to sacrifice for. The fact of sacrificing in itself afforded him a new and joyous sensation. End of chapter 18. Recording by David Ream in Sacramento, California, January 18th, 2009. War and Peace, Book 10, Chapter 19, LibriVox.org by David Ream. On the 24th of August, the Battle of the Shevardino redoubt was fought. On the 25th, not a shot was fired by either side, and on the 26th the Battle of Borodino itself took place. Why and how were the battles of Shevardino and Borodino given and accepted? Why was the Battle of Borodino fought? There was not the least sense in it for either the French or the Russians. Its immediate result for the Russians was, and was bound to be, that we were brought nearer to the destruction of Moscow, which we feared more than anything in the world. And for the French its immediate result was that they were brought nearer to the destruction of their whole army, which they feared more than anything in the world. What the result must be was quite obvious, and yet Napoleon offered, and Kutuzov accepted that battle. If the commanders had been guided by reason, it would seem that it must have been obvious to Napoleon that by advancing 1,300 miles and giving battle with a probability of losing a quarter of his army, he was advancing to certain destruction, and it must have been equally clear to Kutuzov that by accepting battle and risking the loss of a quarter of his army, he would certainly lose Moscow. For Kutuzov this was mathematically clear, as it is that if, when playing drafts, I have one man less and go on exchanging, I shall certainly lose, and therefore should not exchange. When my opponent has 16 men and I have 14, I am only 1/8 weaker than he, but when I have exchanged 13 more men, he will be 3 times as strong as I am. Before the Battle of Borodino, our strength in proportion to the French was about as 5 to 6, but after that battle it was little more than 1 to 2. Previously, we had 100,000 against 120,000. Afterwards, little more than 50,000 against 100,000. Yet the shrewd and experienced Kutuzov accepted the battle, while Napoleon, who was said to be a commander of genius, gave it, losing a quarter of his army and lengthening his lines of communication still more. If it is said that he expected to end the campaign by occupying Moscow, as he had ended a previous campaign by occupying Vienna, there is much evidence to the contrary. Napoleon's historians themselves tell us that from Smolensk onwards he wished to stop, knew the danger of his extended position, and knew that the occupation of Moscow would not be the end of the campaign, for he had seen at Smolensk the state in which Russian towns were left to him, and had not received a single reply to his repeated announcements of his wish to negotiate. In giving and accepting battle at Borodino, Kutuzov acted involuntarily and irrationally, but later on, to fit what had occurred, the historians provided cunningly devised evidence of the foresight and genius the generals who, of all the blind tools of history, were the most enslaved and involuntary. The ancients have left us model heroic poems in which the heroes furnish the whole interest of the story, and we are still unable to accustom ourselves to the fact that, for our epic histories of that kind are meaningless. On the other question, how the Battle of Borodino and the preceding Battle of Shevardino were fought, there also exists a definite and well-known, but quite false conception. All the historians describe the affair as follows. The Russian army, they say, in its retreat from Smolensk, sought out for itself the best position for a general engagement and found such a position at Borodino. The Russians, they say, fortified this position in advance on the left of the high road from Moscow to Smolensk, and almost at a right angle to it, from Borodino to Utitsa, at the very place where the battle was fought. In front of this position, they say, a fortified outpost was set up on the Shevardino mound to observe the enemy. On the 24th, we are told, Napoleon attacked this advance post and took it, and on the 26th attacked the whole Russian army, which was in position on the field of Borodino. So the histories say, and it is all quite wrong, as anyone who cares to look into the matter can easily convince himself. The Russians did not seek out the best position, but, on the contrary, during the retreat passed many positions better than Borodino. They did not stop at any one of these positions because Kutuzov did not wish to occupy a position he had not himself chosen, because the popular demand for a battle had not yet expressed itself strongly enough, and because Miloradovich had not yet arrived with the militia, and for many other reasons. The fact is that other positions they had passed were stronger, and that the position at Borodino, the one where the battle was fought, far from being strong, was no more a position than any other spot one might find in the Russian Empire by sticking a pin into the map at hazard. Not only did the Russians not fortify the position on the field of Borodino, to the left of and at a right angle to the high road, that is, the position on which the battle took place, but never till the 25th of August, 1812, did they think that a battle might be fought there. This was shown first by the fact that there were no entrenchments there by the 25th, and that those begun on the 25th and 26th were not completed, and secondly, by the position of the Shevardino redoubt. That redoubt was quite senseless in front of the position where the battle was accepted. Why was it more strongly fortified than any other post? And why were all efforts exhausted and 6,000 men sacrificed to defend it till late at night on the 24th? A Cossack patrol would have sufficed to observe the enemy. Thirdly, as proof that the position on which the battle was fought had not been foreseen, and that the Shevardino redoubt was not an advanced post of that position, we have the fact that up to the 25th, Barclay de Tolly and Bagration were convinced that the Shevardino redoubt was the left flank of the position, and that Kutuzov himself in his report, written in hot haste after the battle, speaks of the Shevardino redoubt as the left flank of the position. It was much later, when reports on the Battle of Borodino were written at leisure, that the incorrect and extraordinary statement was invented, probably to justify the mistakes of a commander-in-chief who had to be represented as infallible, that the Shevardino redoubt was an advanced post, whereas in reality it was simply a fortified point on the left flank. And at the Battle of Borodino was fought by us on an entrenched position previously selected, where, as it was fought on a quite unexpected spot which was almost entrenched. The case was evidently this. A position was selected along the river Kolocha, which crosses the high road not at a right angle but at an acute angle, so that the left flank was at Shevardino, the right flank near the village of Novoya, and the center at Borodino at the confluence of the rivers Kolocha and Voyna. To anyone who looks at the field of Borodino without thinking of how the battle was actually fought, this position, protected by the river Kolocha, presents itself as obvious for an army whose object was to prevent an enemy from advancing along the Smolensk road to Moscow. Napoleon, riding to Valjevo on the 24th, did not see, as the history books say he did, the position of the Russians from Utitsa to Borodino. He could not have seen that position because it did not exist, nor did he see an advanced post of the Russian army. But while pursuing the Russian rearguard, he came upon the left flank of the Russian position at the Shevardino redoubt, and unexpectedly for the Russians moved his army across the Kolocha. And the Russians, not having time to begin a general engagement, withdrew their left wing from the position they had intended to occupy and took up a new position which had not been foreseen and was not fortified. By crossing to the other side of the Kolocha to the left of the high road, Napoleon shifted the whole forthcoming battle from right to left, looking from the Russian side, and transferred it to the plain between Utitsa, Semenovsk, and Borodino, a plain no more advantageous as a position than any other plain in Russia, and there the whole battle of the 26th of August took place. Had Napoleon not ridden out on the evening of the 24th to the Kolocha, and had he not then ordered an immediate attack on the redoubt, but had begun the attack next morning, no one would have doubted that the Shevardino redoubt was the left flank of our, and the battle would have taken place where we expected it. In that case, we should probably have defended the Shevardino redoubt. Our left flank, still more obstinately. We should have attacked Napoleon in the center or on the right, and the engagement would have taken place on the 25th, in the position we intended and had fortified. But as the attack on our left flank took place in the evening after the retreat of our rear guard, that is, immediately after the fight at Gridneva, and as the Russian commanders did not wish, or were not in time, to begin a general engagement then on the evening of the 24th, the first and chief action of the Battle of Borodino was already lost on the 24th and obviously led to the loss of the one fought on the 26th. After the loss of the Shevardino redoubt, we found ourselves on the morning of the 25th without a position for our left flank, and were forced to bend it back and hastily entrench it where it chanced to be. Not only was the Russian army on the 26th defended by weak, unfinished entrenchments, but the disadvantage of that position was increased by the fact that the Russian commanders, not having fully realized what had happened, namely the loss of our position on the left flank and the shifting of the whole field of the forthcoming battle from right to left, maintained their extended position from the village of Novoye to Utitsa, and consequently had to move their forces from right to left during the battle. So it happened that throughout the whole battle the Russians opposed the entire French army launched against our left flank with but half as many men. Poniatowski's action against the Utitsa and Uvarov's on the right flank against the French were actions distinct from the main course of the battle. So the Battle of Borodino did not take place at all, as, in an effort to conceal our commander's mistakes even at the cost of diminishing the glory due to the Russian army and people, it has been described. The Battle of Borodino was not fought on a chosen and entrenched position with forces only slightly weaker than those of the enemy, but as a result of the loss of the Shevardino redoubt, the Russians fought the Battle of Borodino in an open and almost unentrenched position with forces only half as numerous as the French. That is to say, under conditions in which it was not merely unthinkable to fight for 10 hours and secure an indecisive result, but unthinkable to keep an army even from complete disintegration and flight. End of chapter 19. Recording by David Ream in Sacramento, California, January 19th, 2009. Book 10, Chapter 20, read for LibriVox.org by David Ream. On the morning of the 25th, Pierre was leaving Mozhaïsk. At the descent of the high steep hill, down which a winding road led out of the town past the cathedral on the right, where a service was being held and the bells were ringing, Pierre got out of his vehicle and proceeded on foot. Behind him, a cavalry regiment was coming down the hill preceded by its singers. Coming up toward him was a train of carts carrying men who had been wounded in the engagement the day before. The peasant drivers, shouting and lashing their horses, kept crossing from side to side. The carts, in each of which 3 or 4 wounded soldiers were lying or sitting, jolted over the stones that had been thrown on the steep incline to make it something like a road. The wounded, bandaged with rags, with pale cheeks, compressed lips, and knitted brows, held on to the sides of the carts as they were jolted against one another. Almost all of them stared with naive, childlike curiosity at Pierre's white hat and green swallowtail coat. Pierre's coachman shouted angrily at the convoy of wounded to keep to one side of the road. The cavalry regiment, as it descended the hill with its singers, surrounded Pierre's carriage and blocked the road. Pierre stopped, being pressed against the side of the cutting in which the road ran. The sunshine from behind the hill did not penetrate into the cutting, and there it was cold and damp, but above Pierre's head was the bright August sunshine, and the bells sounded merrily. One of the carts with wounded stopped by the side of the road close to Pierre. The driver, in his best shoes, ran panting up to it, placed a stone under one of its tireless hind wheels, and began arranging the breech band on his little horse. One of the wounded, an old soldier with a bandaged arm who was following the cart on foot, caught hold of it with his sound hand and turned to look at Pierre. "I say, fellow countryman, will they set us down here or take us on to Moscow?" he asked. Pierre was so deep in thought that he did not hear the question. He was looking now at the cavalry regiment that had met the convoy of wounded, now at the cart by which he was standing, in which two wounded men were sitting and one was lying. One of those sitting up in the cart had probably been wounded in the cheek. His whole head was wrapped in rags, and one cheek was swollen to the size of a baby's head. His nose and mouth were twisted to one side. This soldier was looking at the cathedral and crossing himself. Another, a young lad, a fair-haired recruit, as white as though there was no blood in his thin face, looked at Pierre kindly, with a fixed smile. The third lay prone so that his face was not visible. The cavalry singers were passing close by. "All lost, quite lost, is my head so king, living in a foreign land," they sang their soldiers' dance song. As if responding to them, but with a different sort of merriment, the metallic sound of the bells reverberated high above, and the hot rays of the sun bathed the top of the opposite slope with yet another sort of merriment. But beneath the slope, by the cart with the wounded near the panting little nag where Pierre stood, it was damp, somber, and sad. The soldier with the swollen cheek looked angrily at the cavalry singers. "Oh, the coxcombs!" he muttered reproachfully. "It's not the soldiers only, but I've seen peasants today too. The peasants, even they have to go," said the soldier behind the cart, addressing Pierre with a sad smile. "No distinctions made nowadays. They want the whole nation to fall on them. In a word, it's Moscow. They want to make an end of it." In spite of the obscurity of the soldier's words, Pierre understood what he wanted to say and nodded approval. The road was clear again. Pierre descended the hill and drove on. He kept looking to either side of the road for familiar faces, but only saw everywhere the unfamiliar faces of various military men of different branches of the service, who all looked with astonishment at his white hat and green tailcoat. Having gone nearly 3 miles, he at last met an acquaintance and eagerly addressed him. This was one of the head army doctors. He was driving toward Pierre in a covered gig, sitting beside a young surgeon, and on recognizing Pierre, he told the Cossack who occupied the driver's seat to pull up. "Count, your Excellency, how come you to be here?" asked the doctor. "Well, you know, I wanted to see." Yes, there will be something to see." Pierre got out and talked to the doctor, explaining his intention of taking part in a battle. The doctor advised him to apply direct to Kutúzov. "Why should you be God knows where out of sight during the battle?" he said, exchanging glances with his young companion. "Anyhow, His Serene Highness knows you and will receive you graciously. That's what you must do." The doctor seemed tired and in a hurry. "You think so? I also wanted to ask you where our position is exactly," said Pierre. "The position?" repeated the doctor. "Well, that's not my line. Drive past Tatarinova. A lot of digging is going on there. Go up the hillock and you'll see." "Can one see from there? If you would..." But the doctor interrupted him and moved toward his gig. "I would go with you, but on my honor, I'm up to here," and he pointed to his throat. "I'm galloping to the commander of the corps. How do matters stand? You know, Count, there'll be a battle tomorrow. Out of an army of 100,000 we must expect at least 20,000 wounded, and we haven't stretchers or bunks or dressers or doctors enough for 6,000. We have 10,000 carts, but we need other things as well. We must manage as best we can." The strange thought, that of thousands of men, young and old, who had stared with merry surprise at his hat, perhaps the very men he had noticed, 20,000 were inevitably doomed to wounds and death, amazed Pierre. They may die tomorrow. Why are they thinking of anything but death? And by some latent sequence of thought, the descent of the Mosaic hill, the carts with the wounded, the ringing bells, the slanting rays of the sun, and the songs of the cavalrymen vividly recurred to his mind. The cavalry ride to battle and meet the wounded and do not for a moment think of what awaits them, but pass by, winking at the wounded. Yet from among these men 20,000 are doomed to die, and they wonder at my hat. Strange, thought Pierre, continuing his way to Tatarinova. In front of a landowner's house to the left of the road stood carriages, wagons, and crowds of orderlies and sentinels. The commander-in-chief was putting up there, but just when Pierre arrived, he was not in and hardly any of the staff were there. They had gone to the church service. Pierre drove on toward Gorky. When he had ascended the hill and reached the little village street, he saw for the first time pleasant militiamen in their white shirts with crosses on their caps who, talking and laughing loudly, animated and perspiring, were at work on a huge knoll overgrown with grass to the right of the road. Some of them were digging, others were wheeling barrel loads of earth along planks, while others stood about doing nothing. 2 officers were standing on the knoll, directing the men. On seeing these peasants, who were evidently still amused by the novelty of their position as soldiers, Pierre once more thought of the wounded men at Mozháysk and understood what the soldier had meant when he said, "They want the whole nation to fall on them." The sight of these bearded peasants at work on the battlefield, with their queer clumsy boots and perspiring necks, and their shirts opening from the left toward the middle, unfastened, exposing their sunburned collarbones, impressed Pierre more strongly with the solemnity and importance of the moment than anything he had yet seen or heard. End of chapter 20, recording by David Ream in Sacramento, California, January 24th, 2009.